the Federal Reserve Board have said that now understand that high-frequency data has become much more important. So there's a change from the macro to the micro data, in particular in consumers' patterns and behavior and how they interact. So there is a need for having more timely information of the consumer spending and saving patterns. At the same time, there is also new initiatives at the European level, in particular the new European data strategy, which tries to foster a common marketplace for the release and exchange of digital data. So all this has, of course, triggered the way we work with data, and in particular when you're working with microdata, this then leads to that you have the need for working more with data science techniques. So for central banking, these new data sources and the way we work with the micro-level data is to provide supplementary insight. It's not to replace any macroeconomic indicators and data that is finally selected. So providing supplementing insights, near real-time snapshot of what is happening in the economy is to gag and give us indication like early warning indicators, can supplement us in trying to support of detecting trends and turning points, and also extracting also information from the response function of our monetary policy activities. And of course, when you have this bulk of large micro-level data sets, then you can potentially combine them with other fields, and that will then give additional insight that may generate new types of theories. So at the ECB, we are engaged with a lot of new data sets as well of micro-level data, which we are collecting via our regulations. And we have around 30 experimental projects, one of which relates to, and that is also going from experimental to also being in practice. So we are collecting data on a daily basis from NTS Markets, digital trading platform for government bonds, located in Paris. And there we are producing euro area yield curves daily, which are released every day on the ECB website using Swenson and Nielsen Siegel modeling. Then we are using Google data, and together with the chief economist Hilvarian, we are doing nowcasting, in particular nowcasting on households' expenditures and expected expenditure for their consumption pattern, and we have released some papers relating to this on the ECB website as well. With Factiva, we're using this is more on text mining and using text data science technology to try to have also a view on ECB's own press releases and also to nowcast economic activities based on news agencies. And then, of course, relating to our core mandate of having HICP, so inflation rate, we are using the Prisma data, which is providing us granular data on prices of goods, where we're using it to look at volatility and resilience analysis of certain categories of the financial market. Of the basket of products which is included in the HICP. But of course, there's a rich paradigm of borderless records with the new fintech. So all these new trading platforms, I gave the examples of the euro yield curves, but there are of course many payments and clearing systems that have popped up, credit cards use, and in particular consumer spending, mobile payment system, price scanning data also for HICP, social media, and then of course the digital trading platforms and digital consumption platforms, shops like Alibaba, just like Amazon shops. There are new ways of crowdfunding, which is putting lenders and financing needs together. So that is where money is offered from lenders and savers. There's new robot advisors, and then we have, of course, the whole new digital ledger technology, the blockchain technology with crypto assets, and also tokenization, smart contracts. So there's enormous potential of drawing of all these fintech platforms in order to generate insights that you have to get into your production system. So to finalize my main introduction, for moving from macro level to micro level data, the implications is that we need to experiment with these new data sources, and the progress lies with experimenting, though results comes maybe more in the medium to long term. So that is the Amara's law. There's significantly value in at least exploring these new sources for economic and financial activities. And there is certainly a political drive and enabler to develop digital data strategies cross borders. And of course, the main objective is that we should move from these experimental data sets to actually include it as a toolkit. And we should leverage on partnership between central banks, academia, and the private sector as such. Thank you very much. I hope that was indeed right within time. Thank you for that introduction. Over to you.
Thank you, Per. And that was a great introduction. And let me invite Eric to speak next.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And today I'm going to walk you through how we're doing big data, machine learning, and everything else that's great at the Bank of Canada. So before I begin, just to remind everyone that these are the views expressed of myself and not those of the Governing Council of the Bank of Canada. So why we're talking about this here today, it's pretty clear. The world is going digital. It's the commercial viability of AI, ML, big data, robotic process automation, the Internet of Things. This all means that the world's gone digital, and if central banks want to be effective, we need to be able to operate in this new digital era using the tools and the technologies that are available. So the Bank of Canada, we've undertaken two big things in the past year or so. We've initiated a digital transformation strategy, which I'm leading. And here we simply want to be digital first in every aspect of our business. That is how we can bring in those new technologies to do all of our work better, faster, and cheaper at the bank. And to be clear, this is not just about technology. This is about new ways of working in a digital mindset. And so, failing fast, trying new things, being innovative, and taking risks where they're appropriate. We've also implemented an enterprise data analytics strategy. And this strategy aims to make us a leading central bank in the use analysis of data. Essentially, the idea here is we want to be, how can we enable and promote the responsible use of data, emphasize responsible, so we can make better business decisions, have better business insights, economic analysis and insights, and achieve operational efficiencies across the institution, and do so, but also at the same time enabling a culture of innovation and exploration. So these are all nice words, lots of talk. It's nice to have strategies, but to show that it's been very concrete, I'll give you a couple of examples of what we've been doing. And so if you look at this slide here, during, of course, when the pandemic hit, having access to high frequency data to figure what's going on. This is an example of where we take the GDELT news database, which is a global database of news feeds. We run NLP through it to look for sentiment analysis on certain keywords such as economic outcomes, or you can do it for other things. You can do it by country and do it across the globe. And importantly, this is one of many different examples of high frequency data that we use on an ongoing basis. And this is the example put into a Tableau dashboard so that it's live, it's updatable. People can simply go to the Tableau server that we have and look at the data whenever they want and manipulate it at the same time. So this is a very user-friendly, user-centric design is embedded into what we're doing so that the end user of the data can look at it at their leisure, as opposed to waiting for an analyst to send them an email and a static PDF with the information. So, but more broadly, how we're implementing machine learning across the institution, wherever it makes sense to do so. Right now, we have over 25 machine learning, we've lost count, we're doing so many now, machine learning projects underway, with a wide array of applications, not just on the economic side, but also within the institution more broadly. And the examples are the standard ones, whether it's NLP analysis, looking at sentiment analysis. We've done sentiment analysis on our surveys that we do. We actually did sentiment analysis on our own monetary policy report. We published that as a publication of the bank. We use it for trying to improve our forecasts, our nowcasting of the economy. We use it for anomaly detection when we intake data. We run machine learning through it, and then how to deal with them as opposed to doing it manually. Of course, when you do machine learning, there's lots of challenges that you have to be aware of. Of course, the big one we actually found is that getting access to the data in usable form in a timely fashion is a big challenge. It's nice to talk about big data, but actually getting it into on a platform that's usable, making sure that it's high quality, making sure that it's got the appropriate data in it, that we haven't, that's compliant with our ethics and our guidelines and on responsible use of data. Another big challenge, of course, well known in machine learning, is the bias that can come in if you're using a data set that has some bias already embedded in it. The machine learning algorithm will simply replicate that bias, and so we want to make sure we don't have that. Big challenge, of course, too, is explainability. It's one thing to have a nice forecasting tool based on machine learning, but if you have to go to whoever you're giving your results to, and you say, well, the growth is going to be X, and they ask you why, and you can tell them, well, the algorithm told me so, that's not going to be sufficient. You have to understand what's going on underneath the hood in your algorithms and the data you're using it on to make sure that you can explain it. And of course, there's also the robustness of the results. That is, algorithms are alive. They're digital workers, and they need to be invested in. And so you have to make sure you're on top of your algorithms and seeing how they work as new data comes in, and then they adjust to it. So a lot of activity across the institution using machine learning. At the same time, move the slide over. We're automating a lot of things inside the bank. This is one of the, often this low-hanging fruit inside our institutions is we can take a lot of processes that were manual and apply some simple process automation or robotic process automation, whether it's the data feeds coming to the bank, taking information we do have, and putting it into live dashboards on that's just straight through processing. Reporting processes can be automated as well. And of course, we're actually working on virtual assistants inside the institution. Can the virtual assistant help you with something or find some data? We're actually exploring that right now, live inside the institution. Now, for all this to work, for us to be digital first, use the data in the way that we want to do, of course, we have to have the appropriate data infrastructure. And this is actually often a big challenge inside our institutions because we often have lots of legacy systems. And at the bank, the challenge is, and I'm sure this is like in other institutions, there's three big bins of data that you have to think about. One is, the analytic data that's out there that often comes in from official statistics, but also any of those, not just the time series that comes from, say, Statistics Canada, but all the big data that you want to bring in. These are very different types of data. We've also got operations data that, we do a lot of things inside the bank as part of our functions, so it generates a lot of operations data, whether, it's through our financial market activity. And at the same time, we also have, all our institutions have lots of corporate data. This is the HR data or the fin data, the audit data, what's happening in the building. The elevators generate data now, and so where does the data sit, and what do you do with it? And so there's a big question. The ongoing challenge that many institutions face is what's the best place, where to put that data? Should it be in a data lake, or should it be in a data warehouse? Well, it really depends on what the data looks like, how you want to use it, and also how much structure there is inside the data. And so these are all questions that we have to, in order to enable all the things I just talked about, you need to make sure that we have to have that infrastructure in place that's usable, the data is accessible in a good way, an easy way. Of course, in all this, we have to think about, there's lots of trade-offs when you're thinking about how you're going to manage your data and what infrastructure you're going to have. And so we're developing this integrated strategy considering all the different elements of the data that you have to consider. And so you have to think about the security, you have to think about your privacy, you have to think about transparency, you have to think about how accessible is this and to whom inside the institution. And so there's lots of different things you need to think about as you sort of build up your data infrastructure and governance to make sure you can enable and promote the use of the data with these new technologies. And so really this becomes a balancing act between having, on one hand, wanting to allow the analysts and the people in the business to be able to innovate, have the flexibility and agility to use the data, against what I would call the efficiency of managing the data, the rigor which we apply to the quality of the data, and the resilience of the system, and make sure we're adhering to the compliance and all the other aspects that we need to in this environment. And lastly, of course, you need to have, there's so much data out there that's accessible. At the same time, we need to prioritize and how you want to use it. You really need to be able to have a governance structure in place to think about the trade-offs of how you want to prioritize the investments in your data you're going to make. So it's not all data is great, but rather you need to make choices about, given the limited resources, you make choices about what data you're going to have and how you're going to put it into the system. And so these are things that we're working on very hard right now. But as I pointed out before in the previous presentation and the introduction, big data has arrived. All these technologies are there. The question is, how can we as institutions use them in a way that's going to be able to do our work better, faster, and cheaper to achieve our mandates? And I'll end there. Look forward to questions.
Thanks very much, Eric. Hopefully it's working. Howard.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And it was wonderful to hear Per and Eric's presentation just right before. My name is Howard. I'm the VP of Global Affairs at Tcsa. I'm here to share with you about what our team has been researching and discovering for the past few years, the National Data Brain. It is the data-driven monetary policy mechanism for financial stability by central banks. Now, we have been focusing on serving, as an international consultancy, we've been serving central governments and central banks around the world in the modernization and digitalization of national economic governance capabilities. In the process, we have discovered in the past 20 years or so, since the global 2008 financial crisis, much of the world has changed, and yet much has remained the same. What's remained the same is that negative interest rates, excessive quantitative easing, and massive balance sheets are becoming the norm. And this situation has been exacerbated during the pandemic, especially with, for example, the announcement here in the US today that the new stimulus package or health package for all the American citizens. Now, the situation is repeating itself through boom and bust cycles. That's because our currency in each country lacks a real hard value anchor. And that leads to a lot of money printing and a lot of debts and exuberance, and then boom bust cycle. Now, before, our currency was pegged to gold during the gold standard. And then after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, we're pegged to our national sovereign credit or credibility, if you will. So from the gold standard to the dollar standard, what's possible now is a whole new realm of possibility given the advancement of digital technology. That is a data-driven currency value, a data-empowered value-based standard when you can have your currency pegged to quantifiable, real national economic strength. But the question is, do we have the data we need for a data-driven currency model? Like the previous two speakers shared before, yes, we do have a lot of data, but these data are limited in their sources. While there's a lot of data, they also come in overwhelming variety and huge volume as well. What level of granularity can you have access to? And the different data, they come in fragmented formats. Given the situation, the new National Data Brain solution aims to address each of those issues. And the National Data Brain is broken down into three major components. One is the collection of data via a national data collection network. And then second, the management and processing analytics of the data via a national data central processing unit, or you can think of it like the CPU or chip within a computer. Finally, with the tremendous amount of data gathered and organized, what kinds of applications will you open it to and use it in via a national open access data platform? So I want to give an example, a quick example, if I can walk you through a thought experiment. Usually right now, if I walk into a store, a convenience store, supermarket to buy a bottle of water, I scan, the clerk will scan the bottle of water, I will pay $2 for this bottle of water. At the moment, at the point of sale, many pieces of data are generated. The commodity data on the bottled water, financial data on the $2 I paid, the business data on the store, and also consumer data on who I am, where I came from. Right now, these pieces of data are collected separately by different entities, public or private, by the Visa company, by the store. and they're scattered throughout society. And like what we've heard from the previous speakers, many central banks are bumping into the same problem. So many different types of data, so hard to collect, and delayed over so much time when you need the information the most now. What they end up doing is a lot of data mining, data cleansing, data mining, and finally, after much time, expenses, and effort, they try to make sense out of the data a little bit too little, too late. What's possible on the right-hand side here is that all these dimensions of data can be captured right at the point of sales, and they can be piped directly, form a little standardized data package and be piped directly to the central bank at the point of sales. This is a huge breakthrough innovation, and this will cut down on the cost and on the standardization of the data units. Furthermore, once all these data are collected in the management part, in the CPU of the national data plane, they are automatically filtered and organized into 6 dimensions, into very neat little algorithmic units where they're aligned from the micro individual level all the way to the family, company, cities, all the way to the country. So this allows for the easy computation of a large volume of data. And this is a graphic illustration of how the diversity of data and how variety of data, how they are automatically sorted in this process via our algorithmic filter. Finally, with the tremendous amount of data gathered, we can then use it for different needs. While on our open access data platform for the public sector, not only can the central bank make timely monetary decisions based on real-time data, but also other ministries or departments within government or academia can take advantage of it. As well, for the private sector, the access to this type of data can spur further data innovation within the country. Finally, I know this is given time constraint, this is a very high level, broad overview of what's possible in this new digitalization age. It is an irreversible trend, and section. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. So we've had a few questions in online, and a few on your presentation there, Howard. So maybe I'll put these to you first. So one person's asked, how can the platform deal with smaller institutions that might want to submit data through manual processing? I guess how do you overcome that kind of reliance on legacy systems?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again? I didn't quite catch it.
Oh, sorry. Is my microphone still giving problems? I'll try again. So how does the platform deal with smaller institutions and indeed any other kind of systems that are based on manual processing of data? Does it require a very high level of automation throughout the economy?
Okay, that's a great question. In fact, there are two aspects to this, in my answer to this question. First, this system needs to be built on the existing data platform of the central bank, because central bank already has access to the most ubiquitous source of data in society, which is the monetary transaction data. Whether or not it needs to be automated, we predict that over 30% of automation or electronic payment is already sufficient to start building the model and have a ever-closing reflection of the real economy.
Okay, thank you.
And also as well, once the data is collected, we open it back up to the private sector, to the smaller institutions or small businesses, so they have, it's almost a democratization of data access for all. And the idea is to standardize the data for easier access.
Okay,
so small or big institutions
that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So another question's come in that's relevant, but let me give this out to everybody as a sort of general point. What are the challenges relating to privacy when you're dealing with data? I mean, Howard, in the case of your platform, it seems to use a very large quantity of data. So how do you think about privacy? And then let me come after that to Eric and Per, and whether privacy is a challenge for you in your work as well.
Well, the heated debate about data protection and privacy is actually a quite common question for all, and it should be an important concern. First and foremost, our data privacy right now is already an issue that we should be concerned about, because like I said, in that example of swiping the card to buy a bottle of water, our data is already captured by many players, by private sectors, by public sector. So in fact, I would say we already don't have a perfect protection of our data privacy. But more importantly, our data protection is because this is built on top of the existing central bank system. The security and the privacy concerns should be alleviated. That's a safe parallel to the existing system. And finally, transparency towards the data should also help the government build better protection rules and regulations to protect the use and access of such data. And ultimately, would you rather have a profit-driven private sector player owning all of your data, or under the rules and regulations on a transparent public sphere by the government? That's also an interesting point to consider.
Okay, thanks, Howard. And let me put the same thing to Eric. Do you encounter challenges relating to privacy when you're working with data? How does that change the way the Bank of Canada works with data?
And so, as I mentioned earlier, part of the data strategy is that we want responsible use of data, and so we take privacy very, very seriously. Central banks are built on trust, public trust, of what we do, and so we need to maintain the highest standard with respect to privacy and other elements of how you use data responsibly. And so to that end, both on the security side, we have the appropriate protections for data that we do collect, or data we do access. And then at the same time, we have to make sure if the data are there, when they are there, that they're appropriately anonymized and there's responsible use around that data, and that we're completely compliant with the guidelines and the rules around the responsible use of data. And we've established those rules to a very high standard to do so, because we can't be using data irresponsibly. We need to make sure that we're at the the vanguard of the highest level of trust on this dimension. And so a lot of effort goes into making sure that data conforms to that and we use it responsibly.
And Per, do you have anything to add? What's your view?
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this question. This is, of course, the bread and butter of central banks. So in that sense, we have confidentiality regulations in place in order to secure data. So this is the bread and butter as part of having the trust vis-a-vis the financial intermediaries that we are dealing with as part of their reporting requirements. So central banks are very much familiar with confidentiality and, of course, on the protection of individual data, and, of course, on anonymizing data and how to macro aggregate the data so individuals cannot be identified. So this should continue. So from having this enormous amount of data available, we should, of course, continue to have the same privacy in the data management. Now, there is, of course, also outside, of course, the central bank community, there is a general data protection regulation at the EU level. And that one needs to be more tailored to the needs of requirements as part of the new data space. And in particularly, of course, when you have this microdata, you want to have identifiers of individuals, identifiers of institutions, units, identifiers of financial instruments, identifiers of transactions. And of course, these identifiers are there to identify units. So, of course, the General Data Protection Regulation shall not hamper the sharing of data for the identifiers, because that is what everyone needs to link data sets together. So there's enormous drive, I believe, that we have to think about what are the enablers for data sharing among public institutions, but certainly also private and public, and of course public, private, and universities, academia, and in particular on the portability rights. So people should still have their ability to remain confidential and have their information submitted to public authorities and should be protected accordingly, though we need to develop significantly further the ability to share identifiers and also the portability rights. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Per. That's very helpful. So we've got a question here on AI and machine learning. The question is asking, is there a kind of a contradiction maybe, or a difficulty in terms of adopting AI and machine learning and similar advanced analytics capabilities where central banks don't have sufficient granular data and the right infrastructure to gather it all in one place? So I don't know, Eric, I guess for the Bank of Canada, there are probably a lot of data sources there, but was that kind of a prerequisite for the adoption of AI tools?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So, one thing that we've seen inside the machine learning community is that, the algorithms are quite well established. They've been working commercially viably on a research basis, for since the early 2010s. And so really the challenge is not whether or not you can find a good algorithm to suit your task, is do you have good data to run the algorithms on? That is part of the art of being a data scientist, being an economist these days, is to know that you are actually, the question you're trying to answer, you have the right data to answer that question. And so I think a lot of the effort really does have to go into curating the right kind of data to address the things that you want to address. And so I would say, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, central banks were not in that place because we didn't have the infrastructure in place and we hadn't done much on it, to be frank. But now we've built the capacity to do so, both on the data infrastructure side to bring in that big data that we need to bring in. At the same time, if we've hired data scientists, we have a community of data scientists at the bank now, and we have a lead data scientist, and their job is to educate others, and but also do the work where we bring in that data and actually use it and implement it in practice. And what we found is, for every success, there's a failure as we try to figure out how this is best going to work. But we have live examples running now in production on how we're using NLP or other things to do our analysis. I think the second part too, the thing you have to think about is often we focus on, does machine learning on the big data set improve your forecast? And it's important to remember that forecasting is not just about having a number to present, but rather how you build your narrative. And one of the nice things about big data is that big data can help you tell stories that you weren't able to tell just with, official sector data that would come with the 2 or 3 month lag at a monthly frequency or a quarterly frequency, but rather you can tell narratives with this big data on a high frequency basis as you're in the moment. And so that's an important aspect, that forecasting is not just about the number, it's about telling the story that makes that number make sense. And big data can really help you. The high frequency data can really help you in that task.
And it's an interesting point you raised there about the NLP, the natural language processing. It strikes me that even a central bank that doesn't have, say, vast quantities of regulatory data, it could still conduct NLP type work on its own publications, or on the body of regulations, or on kind of local news sources. I've seen quite a lot of papers doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. NLP is a very powerful tool. It's well established, and we've done it on ourselves. We've actually published papers on. We looked at the sentiment analysis, the sentiment inside our own monetary policy report. But you can take that technology is very portable, and you can apply it to a lot of different things. And fortunately, a lot of that data, the newsfeed data, that's actually accessible for many central banks. It's very quite accessible data. So if you're generating words, somebody's generating words somewhere, you can run NLP through it if you have a sufficient volume of it. So.
Okay, so we got a question here on how central banks access data, particularly from commercial banks, and whether it's feasible to establish a kind of direct link between the central bank and the commercial banks to gather data in real time. Maybe I'll go to Howard first. Do you have any experience of kind of establishing that sort of real time link? And do you think that's feasible? And then maybe I'll bring in Per and Eric.
Dan, I just want to make sure I got it correctly. You're saying that the data link between commercial banks to the central bank. Is that right?
Yeah, so at the moment, that link is kind of done on an ad hoc reporting basis, whereas
Right.
this is envisaging a kind of real-time permanent link.
Yes, I would say the current supervision regulatory tech for the reporting compliance aspects of the central bank's mandate with the commercial banks, that's a well-established legacy way of reporting on the data. What we're proposing is actually even go back to the source of the data, where every human being's daily activities within society, there's a trace of that, and that is the monetary transaction. Every action and every activity within a person's life leaves an actual transactional mark. And when you can capture the data source surrounding each person, we believe that's a more complete and to deal with the issue at the root cause. And of course, the commercial banks, their financial transactions or their reporting to the central bank is still very important for compliance purposes, but for in terms of forecasting, in terms of decision making, in terms of observing the real economy, the personal, individual, granular monetary transaction data of the entire society will give a better picture and reflection of it.
Okay, thanks very much. And let me go to Per with that as well. Per, do you think it's feasible to establish that kind of real-time link, or is that some way off yet?
Thank you for this wonderful question. And of course, in an ideal world, the question would be that about moving data across different databases. It's about giving access to public authorities, or whoever needs to have access, via a link to their data sets. So if you can have like a kind of straw into different data sets that are stored and managed by different public authorities, then yes, you can then have a real-time look at the individual firms that you have a need for. So of course, for monetary policy, financial stability, this would be wonderful. That's also why we have micro-level data. So it's not a big issue for central banking when we have the micro-level data based on regulations. So in that sense, we have it on every single security, and we have it on bank loans to other banks, and also bank loans to corporates as part of the ANA credit. But of course, it is when you want to have the need to have access to private banks and private firms outside the regulatory framework where it becomes more tricky. So the answer is yes, of course. I can see that there could be a potential need in the future of real-time access, but of course the horizon of monetary policy and banking and financial stability is to the medium term, right? So you can have snapshots of every day the situation of how inflation rate is going on a daily basis, but are they signaling anything because of its volatility on a day-to-day basis? basis, or it will just monetary laundering activities. So I think there's a gigantic thinking process that needs to be done in order to see it, but of course there also has to be a well-justified need for it. May I add something that Howard has said? Because Howard's presentation, I really liked it a lot, and it goes very much into the European strategy for data, and in particular also the governance of data, which is one of the key pillars of the new white paper that the Commission has released, in particularly on the data attribution and central interpoint to data and data sharing services. So I think Howard has already seems to have already implemented and what is already now in the thinking of the governance structure of data. And maybe let me add to the discussion as well, if I may, Dan, just to give it the context that when we're talking about data, it's about numeric, but it's certainly also textual data, right? So data is both text and numeric values. Just to add that to the discussion. Thank you, Dan.
I've got a comment here as well, which kind of adds to this point about a real-time bank just kind of starting out with this?
So I think there's different elements you would want to think about. The first one is you have to look at your existing data infrastructure. What are your legacy systems, and to think about what end state data infrastructure you want to have. One of the great challenges is it's very tempting just to jump right in, start onboarding legacy right there, and you don't want to end up with a legacy debt on the data side that you need to unwind at some future time when you actually want to consolidate your data into data lake or data warehouse or the appropriate infrastructure. And so I think before you jump in, you have to think about what your system looks like today and how you're going to evolve it to where it needs to be. I think the second thing is you need to make sure you have the skills to use it. So, having someone just learn some Python and start running some algorithms is not going to be enough. What you need is to hire the expertise. On the data science side